Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks very much for being civil as you scrounge for seats. We're clearly close to capacity here. Let's just make sure that we keep the aisles clear. And I apologize to those of you who are standing, but that just attests to Rick and Jenny. I'm Lewis Robinson. I'm the programming manager this year here at the Portland Public Library. We have Print, a bookstore selling copies of both Rick's and Jenny's books. Thank you to them. Thank you also to Coffee by Design, who I'm sure all the coffee is gone too, but
but there was coffee.
There was coffee, and it was delicious. There are hearing assistance headsets in the back that are tied to the sound system. Restrooms in the hall, and please take this opportunity to silence your phones. Just very quickly, 2020, we'll have Mira Batassin, Maria Padian, Tess Gerritsen, Jess Anthony, Lily King, Phuc Tran, all for events here at the library. And those dates in that lineup will be on a sheet outside of the library, so you can grab one as you leave and mark your calendars. Jennifer Finney Boylan, author of 15 books, is the inaugural Anna Quinlan Writer-in-Residence at Barnard College of Columbia University. Her column, Men and Women, appears on the op-ed page of the New York Times on alternate Wednesdays. She lives in New York City and in Belgrade Lakes, Maine, with her wife, Dee Dee. Richard Russo is the author of 8 novels, most recently Everybody's Fool and That Old Cape Magic, 2 collections of stories, and the memoir Elsewhere. In 2002, he received the Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls, which, like Nobody's Fool, was adapted to film in an award-winning HBO miniseries. In 2016, he was given the Indie Champion Award by the American Booksellers Association. And in 2017, he received France's Grand Prix de Littérature Américaine. He lives in Portland, Maine. Please welcome Rick and Jenny.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Rick.
Jenny?
What's happening? This is what I was thinking. Maybe you and I could have a little conversation, talk about this amazing new book, chances are, for about 25 minutes or so, and then we could see if people in the audience have questions that they'd like to ask you. And me, too, because, I'm also a writer. But perhaps the best way to begin is with a reading. Is there a part of Chances Are you wanna kick us off with?
Well, sure. I'll just read a short section from the beginning of the book. The 3 old friends arrived on the island in reverse order from farthest to nearest. Lincoln, a commercial real estate broker practically cross-country from Las Vegas. Teddy, a small press publisher from Syracuse. Mickey, a musician and sound engineer from nearby Cape Cod. All were 66 years old and had attended the same small liberal arts college in Connecticut where they had slung hash at a campus sorority. The other hashers, mostly frat boys, claimed to be there by choice because so many of the thetas were hot, whereas Lincoln, Teddy, and Mickey were scholarship students doing their job out of varying degrees of economic necessity. Lincoln, as good-looking as any of the frat boys, was immediately made a face man, which meant donning a scratchy white waist-length jacket to serve the girls in the sorority's large dining room. Teddy, who had worked at a restaurant during his junior and senior years of high school, was made a cook's helper, making salads, stirring sauces, plating entrees, and desserts. Mickey, they took one look and escorted him over to the sink, where a mountain of dirty dishes sat piled alongside a large cardboard box of off-brand steel scrubbers. Such was their freshman year. By the time they were seniors, Lincoln had been made head hasher and could offer both of his friends positions in the dining room. Teddy, who had had enough of the kitchen, promptly accepted. But Mickey doubted that there was a serving jacket big enough to fit him, and anyway, he preferred remaining a kitchen slave to making nice with the fancy girls out front, since at least the galley was his own. Converging on the island 44 years later, all three were grateful for the educations they received at Minerva, where classes had been small and their professors available and attentive. To the naked eye, it looked like most other colleges did in the late 60s and early 70s. The boys had long hair and wore faded jeans and psychedelic t-shirts. In dorm rooms, kids smoked dope and covered the smell with incense and listened to the Doors and Buffalo Springfield. But these were mere matters of style. To most of their classmates, the war seemed a long way off, something that was going on in Southeast Asia and Berkeley and on TV, but not in coastal Connecticut. Editorials from the Minerva Echo were forever lamenting any real activism. "Nothing's happening here," one said, riffing on the famous song lyric. Why that is ain't exactly clear. No place on campus was less rebellious than the Theta House. A few of the girls smoked weed and went braless, but otherwise the sorority was a protective bubble. And yet it was here, far more than in their classes, that the real world began to reveal itself conspicuously enough that even 19-year-olds like Lincoln and Teddy and Mickey couldn't ignore it. The cars parked out back of the Theta House were not only nicer than those in the regular student lots, but also those in the faculty lot. Stranger still, at least to young men who didn't come from wealth, the owners of these vehicles in the Theta lot didn't feel particularly lucky to be at Minerva, or to have parents who could afford the staggering tuition. Where they came from, Minerva was just a natural extension of the first 18 years of their lives. Indeed, for many, this had been a safety school, and they spent their freshman year getting over the disappointment of not getting into Wesleyan or Williams or one of the Ivies. So they had known the statistics and on the grades and SATs required to get into such elite institutions, but they were used to having other factors count too, things that you couldn't talk about or quantify, but that nevertheless caused doors to magically open. Anyway, Minerva was fine. At least they'd gotten into the Theta House, was how they looked at it. Otherwise, they might as well have gone to UConn. On December 1st, 1969, the evening of the nation's first draft lottery, Lincoln convinced the house mother to let the Hashers serve dinner half an hour early so that they could all crowd around the tiny black and white TV in the back room where they ate their meals. Given that their fates hung in the balance, the mood was strangely buoyant, at least at the beginning. Of the 8 Hashers' birthdays, Mickey's came up first, 9th out of 366 possibilities, causing the other Hashers to break into a chorus of "Oh Canada," which might have gone over better if they had known more than the first 2 words of the song. Of the 3 friends, Lincoln's came next at 189, better but not safe enough, and impossible to make plans around. As the lottery continued, a relentless drumbeat of birthdays, April 1st, September 23rd, September 21st, the mood in the room grew more somber. Earlier, while serving the girls' dinner, they had all been in the same boat, but now their birthdays made individuals of them, people with singular destinies. And one by one, they drifted away, back to their dorm rooms and apartments, where they would call their parents and girlfriends and discuss the fact that their lives had just changed. Some for the better, others for the worse. Their grades and SATs and popularity suddenly beside the point. By the time Teddy's birthday finally came up, he and Lincoln and Mickey were the only guys left in the Hasher room. Passionately opposed to the war, Teddy had told his friends earlier in the day that he would go to Canada or jail rather than get drafted. So to him, the lottery was meaningless. But of course, that wasn't really true. He didn't want to go to Canada, and he wasn't sure that when push came to shove, he would have the necessary courage of his convictions to actually go to jail in protest. Distracted by these thoughts, by the time that only 20-odd unannounced birthdays remained, he was convinced that his had already been read out and he'd somehow missed it, maybe when they were adjusting the TV's rabbit ears. But then, there it was, 322nd out of 366. He was beyond safe. Reaching to turn the TV off, he realized his hand was shaking. There were a dozen or so thetas that they counted as friends, but only J.C. Calloway, with whom all three were in love, was waiting outside the sorority's back entrance when they finally emerged into the frigid dark. Once Mickey told her, with that big, goofy grin plastered on his face, that it looked like he was headed for Southeast Asia, she slid down off the hood of the car that she had been sitting on, buried her face in his chest, hugged him close, and said into his shirt, "Those fuckers." Lincoln and Teddy, both luckier on a night when that, and not smart or rich, was what you desperately wanted to be, managed nevertheless to feel intense jealousy when they saw the girl of their collective dreams in Mickey's arms. Never mind the uncomfortable truth that she was already engaged to another young man entirely. As if Mickey's good fortune in this brief moment somehow mattered more than the short straw he had drawn an hour earlier. Then, as his birthday was announced, both Lincoln and Teddy had the same sickening reaction, that 2 years ago, the people in charge had taken one look at Mickey and assigned him to the shittiest hasher duty in the Theta House. And when he reported for duty, he would again be sized up at a glance and sent straight to the front lines, a target no sniper could miss. Right this minute, though, with JC nestled in his arms, they could not believe his incredible good fortune. This is called youth. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Well, first of all, thanks for that. It's profoundly moving to travel to that moment in time with you. I think it's impossible to read this book, no matter what age you are, but particularly if you are of a certain age, as we say, not to remember that time and to be profoundly moved by it. I was thinking earlier today there's an old Pennsylvania Dutch expression: we are too soon old and too late smart.
That's right.
I wonder if you feel that way in some ways, that given that this is a book about the passage of time, if you think about what you know now that you did not know then, and how has that affected your life as a writer?
I know now. It seems to me that I knew precious little either then or now. Gosh, I think that one of the things that I know now that I certainly did not know back when I was writing my first novel was just how difficult it is to write one of these things.
Right.
I remember as a 30 and 40-year-old thinking that this was going to be easy. And I remember writing my first novel, Mohawk, second novel, The Risk Pool, and even into my third novel, Nobody's Fool, thinking to myself when I began that book, I can do this. There's no reason why I shouldn't be able to write this book. I'd been studying, I'd been learning how to do it for a long time. And I had a habit back then of writing very, very quickly. And I had a kind of intellectual or maybe emotional habit of not worrying an awful lot when what I was doing was really crappy. Because I thought of it the way people in film, they have this expression people in film have about the actual shooting of the movie when they know that they didn't get the take that day. The sun went behind a cloud, or an actor injured herself, or something. Whatever was supposed to happen that day didn't happen, or it happened and it happened badly. The scene just didn't work the way it was supposed to. And they have the expression that they have is, well, we'll fix it in post.
We'll fix it in post.
Right?
Right.
And I had this, even as a novelist, I think I had this idea that when I wrote badly on any particular day, that I would fix it later. How hard could it be? I think was probably the exact expression that I had. And because I now know that that's not true, with each
Wait, you know now that it's
well,
not true?
because
You
I
won't
know
fix it, suppose?
because I now know how difficult this is, and I know how many ways there are to screw up a book, having done most of them.
Yeah.
I'm now a very different kind of writer because I just can't have that kind of that chutzpah that I had as a younger writer. And so when I sit down to write now, chances are, if I've written badly that day, I find myself revising much, much earlier than I used to. Because that faith that I had, oh, things will work out, right? That faith that I have has been profoundly undermined by reality and experience. The way experience and reality will undermine optimism at times.
Do you think that's also a result of just being older? That I think when you're young, there's a sense of, so whatever. I've got all these days. I've got all these years.
Yeah.
Today didn't, whether I won or lost today, it doesn't matter so much. But, when you're our age, there's a sense
Nice of you to lump our ages
Yeah,
together
I think so.
like that, since we are far from the same age.
You got 9 years on me,
Yeah.
but they're important 9 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying that as a joke, but also, so you graduated 71 from college,
From college in 71.
and I was 80, and so my experience of the war, well, was very, very different. We can talk about that in a moment. But I was remember there's I hope this isn't too great a leap. There's a Randy Newman song called "I'll Never Get Over Losing You." Do you know this tune?
I know that one.
He wrote it. Actually, he knew someone who his brother is an oncologist, in fact, and a patient of his had died in his 50s, and the parents, who were in their 80s, came in, and they were survivors of the Holocaust, in fact, and they just said, "We'll never get over this. We'll never get over losing our son." And the Newman's brother, the doctor, said something like, "Well, I don't know how he phrased this exactly, more gently than I'm about to phrase it, but something like, well, you went through the Holocaust. So with the passage of time, and you went through the Holocaust, and you eventually you made a life, and you lived, you have a family, and you lived a good life, and so it is a tragedy to lose your child, but time goes on, and again, this is a couple in their 80s, and they said something like, there isn't time enough for us to get over it. There's the chorus of the song is something like, when you're young and there's time, you forget the past. You don't think that you will, but you do. But now I haven't got time enough, and I'll never get over losing you. So something about when, as a writer,
This book is about that in a way, isn't
That's- yeah.
This book is about those things that we can't get over even when we try to. The book for me, as I recall my struggles to write it, the difficulty was that the story was taking place on two tracks, which is one is a very public track, and that's one of the sections that I read from, because it is a story about the Vietnam War and the ways that I think it's fairly obvious today politically and in every other way culturally that we're still not over that. So there's that public story, and then there's the story of three young guys who are now three old guys, who there are certain things not only about that era but about themselves and a girl that they were all in love with, that 44 years later, it doesn't take much to make those memories real. And so in some ways, yeah, there isn't time enough. There isn't time enough to get over this stuff.
and there's something about being, being young, whatever that means, 16 to 25,
Yeah.
or that part of youth, in which the things that are happening to you, affect your whole life, and you remember those things. They're like the little, those little phrases. In fact, I was writing about this yesterday. I remember coming up a set of stairs, coming out of the subway, and looking over my shoulder. I passed someone. She looked at me. I looked at her, and I was going on my business. But at the top of the stairs, I turned back, and she was at the bottom of the stairs, and she had turned back, and she was looking at me. And for like a second, we looked at each other, and there was a possible world in which we went and we said, "Who are you?"
Yeah.
But then people came into the subway and people moved on, and I just said, "Well," and I moved on, and she moved on. And you know the old cliche, not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of that. Well, it's not true, but I do think about her sometimes, now and again, and think, what was that door that was never opened? And I think there's a way in which we're haunted, particularly when you're of a certain age. The door that was never opened haunts us. And if ever there was a door that opened or didn't open, December 1st, 1969 would be a date just like that.
And one of the joys of touring with this book, which I had not anticipated, probably should have, but didn't, was how many people after a reading, after an event like this, how many people were going to come up to me and want to tell me their draft number. Wanted to not only tell me their draft number, but where they were when it happened. And we're not talking just about guys here either, because the women wanted to tell me about their brothers, what their brother's draft number was, or what their boyfriend's number was. And I did find that to be particularly moving and perhaps unexpected, because most of my novels have really been about my parents' generation, and the most important of the characters in those novels were of my parents' generation. And I've always considered myself to be a writer of that generation, because as a boy, I still remember, even in the small kind of out-of-the-way mill town that I grew up in, there was that tremendous sense of America as a place of opportunity. And having won the Second World War, when my father and all the other guys came back and either went back to work or went on the GI Bill, went back to school or started families, there was this sense at the time that America was, whatever doors had been erected, or walls had been erected. To keep certain Americans from certain places, that all those walls were going to come down, and there was that tremendous sense of my parents' generation of optimism, that America was going to be the kind of place that it would include them, right? And I think really right up until pretty close to this book, I've always seen myself as a writer taking snapshots of a world that was disappearing before right. my eyes. And what was so both unsettling but also deeply gratifying was to realize in touring with this particular book that I seem to be writing about my own generation, even if it is as an elegy, because people have come up to me, and I had one friend with whom I had never talked about the war say that and he remembered exactly where he was and remembered a particular gesture. He said that when the lottery was over, he went outside. He was smoking a cigarette, and he tossed it on the ground, rubbed it out with his shoe, and he said, "I never smoked again after that." He said, because it occurred to me that if my country wasn't going to try to kill me, then I wouldn't kill myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if, just a quick show of hands from the audience, if you would raise your hand if you remember where you were on December 1st, 1969, when the lottery happened. Look at all those hands. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, another thing about this book that struck me as wonderful, but also new compared to some of your previous work, is that it is, or appears to be at times, a mystery. And I read the first 2/3 of the book, and I'm going to carefully avoid spoilers if I can for the 2 people in the room who haven't finished this book. And you know who you are. Actually, it might be the 2 of us. Damn. The first half to 2/3 of the book, it is a mystery, and it suddenly occurred to me. I remember being a little cross with you. It's like, okay, look, he's a great screenwriter, he's a great novelist, he writes great stories and essays, and now he's going to be a mystery writer. Like, leave something for the rest of us. So, could you talk a little bit about that? Did you some of the things I'm interested in? Did you see it as a mystery from the beginning? If so, did you figure out the who done it from the beginning? I don't think it's giving anything away to say that JC, the girl in that first scene, disappears mysteriously. She disappears.
Oh, you learn that right.
She disappears in
right
the first or second chapter. Yeah. So, and the question becomes, what happened to JC? Yep. You have. So I'm wondering if you figured out the answer to that question early on, whether you the book is not exactly a mystery by the end, and there's a moment when it turns. Tell me about some of these issues. Yeah. Whether it felt like you're writing a different kind of book, and to what degree did you have to figure out some things in advance that you normally leave till later?
Yeah. Because my normal modus operandi is, I suspect a lot like yours, Jenny, is that we'll figure this out as we go, and part of the joy of novel writing, storytelling, is to figure it out the same way the reader does.
Yeah, and that's the thing we tell our students.
Yeah, and we tell our students
that a book will reveal itself to you, and there's a certain organic joy to seeing what's going to emerge from the real story. But it's the only example that we always say, except if you're writing a mystery. Right, in which case, you don't want to get to the last chapter and go, well, hell, I don't know who done it.
Well, and the reason...
How would I know?
And the reason I knew to expect that and tried to figure out at least the broader strokes of answering that question, what happened to JC, was an earlier experience where I was writing a mystery with my friend Robert Benton, who is the director of a movie called Twilight, a detective movie that we wrote together, almost 2 decades ago now. And we proceeded. He made the kind of movies that were similar to the kinds of books that Jenny and I write, very character-driven things, and so he like me, he loved mysteries, loved mystery stories, but he'd never written one, and I hadn't either. And so we decided we would do a detective movie together, and we started off, and I would write a couple of scenes, we'd fleshed out some of the characters, and then I would send the pages to Benton, Benton would revise them, send them back, and then I would carry the story forward, and then sometimes we would shift, and he would write first, and I would follow behind him. But a normal screenplay is anywhere from 90 pages to maybe 120 pages. A lot of that is white space. Around page 60 or 70, Ben said, "Why don't you come to New York? Because I think we have a few things to talk about here." So I came to New York, and we sat down, and he said, "All right, we're 2/3 of the way through this screenplay. Who did it?" And I said, "I thought you knew." And so we did right then. What we should have done at the beginning is decided who done it and worked backwards, because that's the way you have to write this kind of story. You have to start with that known thing that in any other kind of book you wouldn't necessarily know, because it would ruin the surprise for yourself right, as the writer. So in this I remember knowing a couple of things. I knew that JC was going to disappear, and I knew kind of why. I knew kind of what happened to her. I didn't know the details. I didn't know all the details. When we actually got to it, some of the details were a surprise to me. But I did know the broad strokes of what happened to her. And I also knew that by the end of it, I wanted readers to put the book down with the feeling that, yeah, it felt like a mystery all the way through until you get the answer that you've been searching for. But I wanted them to put the book down and say, oh, God, this wasn't a mystery. This was something else. Right. That we were the journey that we thought we were on was not the one that
It turns out it's a Richard Russo novel after all.
Yes, that's right. After all, as we might have predicted, it does turn out to be a Richard Russo novel. Yeah. After all,
who knew? Hey, I think I should ask one last question, and then maybe see if the audience has questions of their own. But I think it would be people would be cross with me if I didn't ask you about men and women, about which I know a thing or two. And so here's a story about three men and the woman, mostly absent, who joins them emotionally and in fact physically toward when they all come together in the same space in some ways to have kind of an emotional seance to channel her memory. I want to go back to that. Well, I want to hear your thoughts about JC and about the way women, in this case a woman, connect friends, connect men, connect male friends. But also to go back to that first question of what do you know now that you didn't know at an earlier point in your life about writing about the lives of women and men.
Well, JC, we'll start with JC here. JC is an interesting character in the first half of this book, or the first 2/3 of this book, because she is a cipher. Not only has she disappeared, but the first half of this book, or maybe the whole book, is not about what men know about women, it's about what they don't know about them. In some cases, because they haven't really been interested to ask. You know, they just, the questions, the important questions about women when you're 19, as these young men are in the early scenes of the novel, you don't have to know a woman to be in love with her, and in some cases you're kind of better off not. So really, the first part of this book is not about what Lincoln and Teddy and Mickey know about JC. It's really about what they don't know. And they're only now at age 66 trying to understand her better without now, of course, the tools to do so, because she's been gone for 44 years. They remember that they loved her, and they remember part of why, because she was among other things, she was a wild child. She represented all of the things that they knew nothing about but hoped to very soon, including sex. So she's in a way they're projecting themselves onto her, and it's only really at the end when the question is answered about what happened to JC that we really that a real woman's character comes through at the end. And fortunately, there are two other, at least, really important female characters in the book who are Lincoln's and Teddy's, the women in their lives, and they're more important. But I think that, to go back to your original question about what do I know now that I didn't know when I was a much younger writer, I think as a male writer writing in my early career about male misbehavior, mostly, those were very male-centered novels, and I think around Nobody's Fool with Miss Burrell, and then all of the books that came after that, I think it was just a feature of my looking up one day and realizing that even though my subject matter to this point had been male, all of the important people in my life were women.
Thanks.
I didn't mean that you had to go to extremes.
Oh, you mean
But it was a wonderful gesture. On your,
I did it for you. And can I just say, it's a slippery slope. So.
No, but I mean, at the time I was talking about, before you and I had met, when I looked up one day, my father was gone. My father had died, and my mother was still very much alive, and I had a wife with whom I was and still am in love, and two daughters who were the apple of their father's eye. And as I said, suddenly all the important people in my life were women, and I think my fiction changed right then as a result of that fact, because I knew from that point forward I was going to be populating these novels with women who have to ring true. And I think that there's nothing that scares a male novelist any more than the possibility that people are going to read his books and say, he just doesn't know a damn thing about women, and it makes us cautious. But at some point I realized that I simply couldn't be the writer that I wanted to be without imagining the lives of women.
Thank you. Let's see if the audience has some questions that they'd like to ask. Here's the amazing Lewis Robinson, who has a microphone in hand, and he'll bring it to you. There's, let's see, where do you want to go? We'll go here and then way back there. We'll start right here in the front.
Behind the pillar, you couldn't.
Thank you so much for coming. It's so great to see you. I did read the book, and I don't know, your publishers or whoever promotes it. One of the reasons I chose to, I like your writing, but so many of these kinds of books are about women getting together, and I think I can't remember what it said, but it was about 3 guys.
Yeah.
And that was in itself a very different approach. So, and I did learn a little bit about how guys hang out like women. And we're not that different, really, Yeah. And I'm 66, so I know this was written a couple years ago, but it was also very poignant for me. So I enjoyed it. I recommend it to everyone, but mainly I just want to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart for She's Not There. That was so powerful for me. I love that book. And I haven't read all of your books, Richard, but I do want to read more. But your afterword, but your afterword, whatever that was, you commented at the end of the book about your process. I cried, and I thought that was one of the best pieces of writing I've ever read. Is that what it was? An afterword
to Rick's afterword to my book.
Yes, yeah. I cried, and it was brilliant. So thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. This was way over there.
Yeah, the way down. Yeah.
There was that afterword that Rick wrote was which, by the way, he did for nothing. No, I don't mean that as a joke. He literally contributed in some ways the most important chapter of that book, and he did it as a friend. It was a gift, one of the things about writing memoir is that it's hard to know how to conclude a story about a life when you're still alive. And at that time, at least in the first edition of that book, the story didn't have a perfect resolution. So I felt as if I'd pitched 8 innings, and then they took me out, and they handed it over to Russo, who I think of as the closer.
Well, and as Barbara can vouch for, my wife, I never go anywhere with a crowd that's anything like the size of the crowd in this room, where at least one person in that crowd doesn't come up and say pretty much exactly what you said, and wanting to know how Jenny's doing.
What do you tell
What's the state? None of this has gotten back to you, huh? So, but thank you.
Hey, we'll talk.
Yeah.
There you are. Hi.
Hi, I was number 10 in the lottery, just so you could know.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question or a comment about a book that you wrote called Trajectory, and it had 4 wonderful stories in it, excellent, and one struck me, and was the one of Marcus and Milton,
Right.
and it was one of the few books that I've read twice. I enjoyed it, and I just wanted to delve into it more. One of the characters, Wendy, seems to have been a homage to Paul Newman. It seems
Absolutely.
to have been,
Yep.
to me. There were different characteristics. And I know that you've collaborated with him at least on 2 movies.
Yep. 3. Yep.
3.
Yep.
And I just wanted to know, how was he to work with?
Well, you know, number one, he's just such a wonderful actor. So when you get to work with talent at that level, you just really have an appreciation of what great actors do. I'm one of the luckiest writers on the face of the earth in that the people that I've worked with on so many of my projects are of that caliber. But there's really only one Paul Newman, both as an actor, but also as a citizen. You all know what he does with Newman's Own. All of the profits from that charity, all of the profits from those products go to charity. But also as a friend. I think that maybe like the 5th or 6th phone call I got to congratulate me when I won the Pulitzer was from Paul. He was just an incredibly generous man whose legacy is unlike that of any actor I know of. I was just last week, as a matter of fact, I drove down to Fairfield because there was a fundraiser for Paul's Hole in the Wall Gang camp in Connecticut. So I went down and took part in that. Melanie Griffith came all the way from L.A., which says something. She worked on the movie of Nobody's Fool with Paul, but she felt like that she owed him so much all these years later that she wanted to come all the way from L.A. to be part of this fundraiser for the Hole in the Wall Gang camp. So his when I came to write Everybody's Fool, and was resurrecting Sully after 20-some years, I think the thing that I can say most about my relationship with, or what happened as a result of meeting Paul Newman as a result of that movie being made, is that when it came time for me to write Everybody's Fool, in which Sully was going to play a major role, even though he wasn't the main character of that book, when it came time to resurrect Sully, I discovered that he wasn't really completely mine anymore, because he was mine in the sense in the first book because he was so modeled on my own father, and writing the book allowed me to spend a lot more time with my old man because I didn't really get to know him until I was almost an adult. And so I felt cheated of his company when he died. I didn't get to know him until late, and then he died early. So I thought of Sully as mine, my own property, until it came time to write Everybody's Fool, and brought him back to life again, only to discover that he had now had a perfect meld with Paul Newman. And I found myself, whereas before I was channeling my father in the first book, I found myself now channeling Paul in his portrayal of Sully in that movie, and he was just no longer my sole property. So that's kind of an example of what it's like to work with a talent like that is so remarkable and also so singular.
Wonderful. Let's do maybe one more question, and then maybe we'll end things with one more short reading. Let's see. There was a hand right here in the front.
I appreciate so much of the writing of both of you, and I'm grateful that you're here today. My question is related to Richard. Much of your writing in my opinion, is sort of a memoir nature. Sometimes you call it such, sometimes you don't. And you have said here that you wrote most of your books with regard to your parents' generation.
Yeah.
And now this one with regard to you. So my question is simple. Which of the three characters did you most identify with yourself? And what was your draft number?
I gave Teddy my draft number. 322 was my draft number. And Mickey's draft number, Mickey's number 9 was also a friend of mine. I actually split my own psyche into 3, I think, in writing this book. Lincoln represents all of the times in my life when I think that I have played it safe, often because I needed to. What all of these 3 young men have in common, of course, is that they don't come from wealth, and they're playing this game of life without a safety net. And so there have been times when Barbara and I were first married, and then when the children came along, and I wasn't making any money from my novels yet. And there was a time when there were times when I really played it safe because I knew how many people were depending on me. And I think Lincoln is a guy who's pretty conservative by nature, but he's also gotten in the habit. We all get into habits. He's gotten in a habit of playing things kind of safe. So that's, I mean, but Lincoln is in large measure me, in the sense that that's what I was drawing on for his character. Teddy, I think, represents some of the more artistic aspect. He's not a writer, but he's an editor, and he's a fixer of things, and he has literary ambitions, although he has put all of his on the back burner. And so that aspect of Teddy was drawn right from my own experience. And there are times, even now, and I'm 70 now, so it's 66 when these guys were in the book, but I'm 70 now. And Mickey is still that time when the right song comes on the radio. And there's nothing in this world I want to do, including write. There's nothing in this world that I want to do more than strap on a guitar and play rock and roll, as Mickey puts it, at a very loud volume.
Yeah.
So I really identify with all 3 of them.
Well said. Speaking of Mickey and number 9.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's let Mickey finish things up for us today.
It's a little bit lighter too. This has been. The other interesting thing about this book is that, of course, it's generated a lot of serious discussion. The discussions, in some ways, is more serious than the book, because there is a fair amount of humor here. Mickey Girardi was from a rough working-class neighborhood in West Haven, Connecticut, famous for bodybuilders, Harleys, and ethnic block parties. His parents were Irish and Italian, his old man a construction worker. His mother a secretary in an insurance agency, both deeply committed to assimilation. They flew the flag, and not just on the 4th. A veteran of the Second World War, Mickey's father could have taken advantage of the GI Bill, but he knew a guy who could get him into the pipefitters union, which he figured was better. Mickey was the youngest of 8, the other 7 all girls, and he was spoiled rotten in so many respects. Clothes bought especially for him, his own room, right from the start. Okay, it was about the size of a closet, but so what? The family's house was large, as it needed to be, but also modest, only 3 blocks from the beach. Great in the summer, when the cool breezes came in off the water. When the wind changed direction, though, you felt like you were living under the nearby interstate. The traffic noise was so loud. Sunday dinners, you were home, and no excuses. Spaghetti, and with sausage and meatballs and pork shoulder braising in tomato sauce. Michael Sr.'s mother's recipe, handed down reluctantly to her Irish daughter-in-law. With 1 or 2 key ingredients left out for the sake of contrast. Family first, America second, Or maybe vice versa these days, with so many grubby long hairs always flashing their imbecilic peace signs everywhere. Everything else came a distant third. For Mickey, music came first. His first job was sweeping up the mall music store where he had seen a Fender Stratocaster in the window and fallen in love. After the guitar came an amp, in a band at age 13, by 16, sneaking into raunchy New Haven bars and sitting in with older guys whose girlfriends didn't wear bras and who seemed to enjoy revealing this fact by bending over in front of Mickey, who would later joke with Lincoln and Teddy that he had had a hard-on for all of 1965. I catch you doing drugs with those guys, his father warned. You're going to be the first kid in America ever beaten to death with a fencing guitar. Fender, Mickey corrected him. Well, bring it here, smartass. We'll do it right now. Save time. About the last thing in the world Mickey wanted to do was go to college. In school, he had always hovered between mediocre and piss poor. But all his sisters had gone or were going, and college was what his mother wanted. Community college was the plan. Mr. Easy, his mother called him, always the path of least resistance. And Mickey supposed she was right. He wasn't terribly ambitious, but he failed to see what was so wrong with staying in West Haven. With his sisters gone, there was plenty of room, especially except on Sundays and holidays. Unfortunately, even to go to the community college, you had to take the SAT. So one Saturday morning, Mickey did. Not wanting to disappoint his mother by being the only kid ever rejected by a community college because of his SATs, he had declined a gig the night before and actually gotten a good night's sleep. He figured it wouldn't kill him to try for once. Tuition was cheap, but if he did well enough to snag a few bucks to help with books and expenses, it had put him in good with his old man. When the results came back, his mother met his father at the door. "Have a look at this," she said, pointing at their son's score, which was in the top 2%. "The kid's brilliant," she said. Since Mickey was the only kid in the room, his father looked around to make sure there wasn't another one hiding somewhere. "Which kid?" he said. "This one, your son." His father scratched his head. "This one right here?" "Yes, our Michael." His father studied the SAT results, then his wife, then Mickey, then his wife again. "Okay," he said finally, "who's the father?" "I've always wondered." The next day, Michael Sr. was still trying to work it out. "Take a walk with me," he said, grabbing Mickey's shoulder with a meaty paw. When they were down the block and out of earshot, he said, "All right, come clean. I promise I won't be mad. Who'd you get to take the test for you?" Mickey felt his left eye twitch. "You know what, Pop?" he began. "Don't say it," his father warned. "Fuck you," Mickey said, completing his thought. Senior stopped walking and threw up his hands. "You said it." Then he cuffed his son on the back of the head hard enough to make Mickey's eyes water. "Help me out here," he said, "because I want to understand. You're saying this test is on the up and up?" Mickey nodded. "You're telling me you're smart." "I'm not telling you anything," Mickey said. "You're telling me that all this time you could have done good in school and made your mother proud?" Mickey felt that seeing things in this light took some of the luster off of his near-perfect SAT. He just shrugged. "What were we thinking?" his father said, more to himself than his son. "We were doing so good with girls." "Sorry," Mickey said. "Okay, listen up," his father said, "because this is what's going to happen. You're going to go to college, and you're going to do good. No discussion. You either make your mother proud, or you don't come home." Mickey started to object, only to discover that he wasn't sure that he wanted to. He himself was still processing the remarkable SAT results and had begun thinking beyond community college. At West Haven High, when word had gotten around about his SATs, several of his former teachers had stopped him in the hall and said, "Hey, what have we been telling you?" So instead of objecting To his old man's command, he said, "Can I major in music?" His father looked up at the sky and then back down at him. "Why do you always have to press your luck?" he said. "Can I major in music?" Mickey said. "Fine," Senior said. "Major in fencing guitars for all I care." Mickey thought about correcting him, but his father did have a point. He was always pushing his luck.
Rick Russo.
Thank you. Thank you.